So this is our new book that you might have seen outside. These headlines look familiar. Right now, all the rage for investors in discussing Bitcoin is not necessarily what it's going to do, what the price, but what its environmental impact is. And the general consensus in the media around Bitcoin is that this is an environmental catastrophe. And in one respect that they are correct, because the popular version of Bitcoin is, depending on the day, the most inefficient or the second most inefficient transaction processing network in the world that uses an incredible amount of power per transaction. But then kind of the original vision for Bitcoin, the version of Bitcoin that brings us here today, is the most efficient transaction processing mechanism. So there's a lot of confusion on this. So we think this is important because it's not just, okay, one version of Bitcoin is good, one is bad. We think that a scalable blockchain that, from our perspective, is really just Bitcoin SV today, will really radically transform the way that we interact with information. That's for our global financial system. That's kind of putting every, either the data itself or hash of that data for any important piece of data onto a public ledger over the coming decades. So we think effectively our entire internet will be using a scalable public ledger if we fast forward to say 10, 15 years in the future. So whether this ledger is efficient, whether it uses a lot of power, this is really important. The framework that we have for this is that it's very difficult to say, okay, is this good for the environment? A lot of people just focus on, okay, how much energy does it use, rather than what is the alternative and what is the energy for that use. So the kind of two axioms behind the study we did and the book that we wrote is all else equal, reducing total energy usage is good, and all else equal, reducing carbon emissions is good. So proof of work, this is the part of Bitcoin that people focus on being environmentally harmful. This is also the part of Bitcoin that makes Bitcoin Bitcoin and make this whole thing work. And then the most popular proposed alternative to this is proof of stake. There's also other things, proof of authority. Solana, that probably many people in the room are familiar with, uses what they call proof of history. These are all just different variations of proof of stake from our perspective. The main issue that we run into with these alternative consensus mechanisms is that proof of work, the real innovation is that it's an economic incentive system. It's actually not a technology. There's a bunch of technology built on top of Bitcoin, but we think that the kind of core innovation of Bitcoin is solving this Byzantine generals problem, aligning people that have different interests to solve for truth and to not have an incentive to commit fraud of any kind. By just calling that, say, a consensus mechanism for a technology, you kind of run into this proof of stake world that we have today. And unfortunately, proof of stake doesn't align incentives and doesn't incentivize truth and innovation the way that proof of work does. So while a lot of people are really excited about these other blockchains, some of which, like Solana, are doing lots of transactions like BSV, unfortunately, we don't think that they really provide the same degree of security, finality, authentication that a blockchain should and can provide in the form of, say, Bitcoin SV. For those that have been following this conversation, Stone Ridge, they're connected to the firm NYDIG, and they custody, I think, like $60-something billion of BTC Bitcoin. And they, in their annual letter last year, kind of popularized the notion that Bitcoin really incentivizes green energy adoption, because it doesn't matter where in the world this energy is being created. It just matters that it could be connected to the internet. So the big problem for green energy adoption, whether it's solar or wind, has never been how cheap is it to be able to capture and create that power. It's how cheap is it to distribute that relative to things like natural gas and coal. And when you have distribution as part of it, it historically has largely not been competitive. But if you eliminate distribution already today, it is generally much cheaper. It depends on the price of these commodities, but generally much cheaper to generate, which is why the profit-driven miners today have overwhelmingly chosen using things like hydro and solar and natural gas flare-off, things that can't work for traditional ways of consuming power as part of a grid, but can work for securing the Bitcoin network. So what proof of work has done, and I think will continue to do, is incentivize kind of new novel ways of capturing energy in a way that doesn't have the negative environmental impact of, say, a traditional energy production. So we have kind of a few different metrics that I'd say the consensus investor community uses to kind of discuss this, and we'd like to kind of put forward our own metric, and that's kind of the metric that we go over thoroughly in this book, which is, should we look at overall energy utilization? That's not really an exact metric, and while I'm not a fan of BTC Bitcoin, I don't think it's fair to that network to just say it uses this much energy and it compares to this country. The question is, what does it do, and is that energy worth it? Then a little bit better is the energy cost per transaction. Okay, that's a lot more accurate, but really it's energy cost per transaction relative to the next best alternative. And from our analysis here, we find that processing transactions on Bitcoin SV has a substantially lower environmental impact today than using something like the Visa network. And both of those are orders of magnitude more efficient than, say, using all the other different blockchains or crypto assets out there. So what's great about proof of work is as the network grows, it actually gets more efficient. So in kind of the bull case for, say, BTC Bitcoin, where people are paying millions of dollars in transaction fees, it's settled by central banks and massive private financial institutions. It's never used by anyone. Each transaction, as that network continues to grow, will become less efficient and use more power. But with a proof of work system without a limit on scale, as more people use the network, it becomes cheaper to process each transaction and takes less power per transaction. So there's a nice alignment of incentives between the Bitcoin miners and those that care about reducing carbon emissions or reducing total energy consumption, which is, as the network grows, it continues to get more and more efficient. I think a lot of people today don't understand how transaction-based our existing economy is. When people think of transactions, they just think of payments. But really transactions, there are a lot that is included in transactions. We kind of have a list of them here. Payments are the first thing that comes to mind, but really almost everything that's represented in a communication at some level is a transaction. And transaction processing, we kind of conservatively estimate here 5 to 10% of what the internet, the internet uses about 5 to 10% of global power consumption. That's kind of the conservative estimate for the amount of transactions that are being processed on the internet and the power that's taken from that. But when you look at it, I think in a more holistic way, it becomes more like 20 to 30% of global power consumption is in some way processing transactions. So with companies like Tall out there and likely other competitors in the future, we think that by utilizing something like Bitcoin SV, this will play a very meaningful role in reducing carbon emissions, and perhaps 20 years looking back now will be viewed as one of the kind of greenest economic systems or technological innovations in history. I just wanted to show a couple graphics here which kind of just demonstrate the differences between BTC Bitcoin and BSV Bitcoin, as well as some other blockchains. So today we see that BTC Bitcoin has the vast majority of hash rate. It has many nodes which aren't really necessary for processing transactions. But then in terms of the actual number of transactions and the size of blocks, despite many people not being aware of Bitcoin SV relative to BTC Bitcoin, it has the vast majority of transactions and much, much higher block sizes. Bitcoin SV operations generate less than 1% of the environmental impact of Bitcoin Core today, while supporting the vast majority of transactions on a proof of work blockchain. And that will continue even as BSV supports more and more transactions. There's some more facts on kind of BTC versus BSV. Different market caps, transaction fees are many orders of magnitude apart, $10 versus 1/100 of a cent. And then here's just some more metrics to look at, not just BTC, but the other version of Bitcoin and Ethereum, just to kind of see the difference in transaction processing capability. Today, BSV does the most transactions. There's even a single game on BSV that, since it started to meaningfully get adoption about 2.5 weeks ago, Crypto Fights. I know Adam is here going to be speaking about that. That single game puts more transactions on the BSV blockchain than all of the Ethereum network. So timing with this talk, we released our book online. We brought this here. We also have kind of a short few-page article that makes for kind of an easier read for those that want to learn about the environmental impacts of Bitcoin. And we hope that this plays a meaningful role in the conversation on green energy and Bitcoin. And we welcome any questions from the audience or Jimmy.
Yeah. Could you go back a slide?
Yes.
We'll take a few minutes of questions. I know this is a hot topic. So this comes from a site called coincarboncap.com, right? Which is kind of a play on CoinMarketCap. It's a site that tries to track the energy use and environmental impact of competing blockchains. And if you go to at coincarboncap.com, you'll see BSV is always at the top as the most efficient, because they really calculate it. The answer of energy efficiency and environmental impact really can't be answered in isolation as just a raw amount of energy. It's what do you get for it, right? Like when you think about the amount of electricity used to, run Facebook servers, what do we get in terms of value for it? And so why you're calling BSV green Bitcoin is not that there's not energy used. There is. It's just the amount of processing power and data transactions you can process for it is so much greater that we think that that's the only answer, right? It's, I just want to explain what this slide is. So it's not that there's some absolute answer as to whether it's efficient or not. It's what do you get for the amount of energy used. And we believe, as you've heard today, that Bitcoin was created to create a more efficient payment system for the internet, including for daily transactions. It's a lot of energy being used to support a BTC network where the primary use is just trading. For people wanting to just hold their coins, not spend them, and hope that they get rich, which there's nothing wrong with, right? Absolutely nothing wrong with. It's just a lot of energy and electricity used for that purpose, because that's really what's happened to BTC. Okay, questions for Zach? Yes.
Have you
Edgar.
looked into the recycling of energy for mining, since obviously it generates a lot of heat?
Yeah.
Has there been any advances in that? Do you think that's an area that's going to get more attention as far as reusing that energy to get the net energy costs?
The question is, have we looked into whether or not the energy expended to do mining can be recycled, for example, the heat that's generated by the mining rigs?
Yeah, so there's been a ton of it's well-funded mining companies and startups that have been doing innovative things to take advantage of heat that's generated from other ways of generating power and using that for mining Bitcoin. Peter Thiel has backed 2 companies doing that. We're actually in conversation with a company doing that in California. What's amazing about Bitcoin is that there's just a pure incentive to have as cheap power as possible. Yes. You don't have to worry about distribution, you don't have to worry about politics, you just have to worry about cheap power. So you get green energy, you get kind of all these innovative entrepreneurs doing new things, and I don't think that innovation will stop anytime soon.
Yeah, there's definitely a push to try and use more sustainable resources, hydropower, for example, in particular, to power mining. Yes, any other questions? Yes.
For businesses that are looking at different blockchains and considering where to build their products, why would they care? Like, I certainly have my own thoughts on this, but like in your opinion, why would they care about green efficiencies?
Right. So the question is, for businesses looking to build on a blockchain, why should they care about whether the chain is energy, environmentally friendly and efficient? Because they do care. So why do they care?
So there's a number of reasons to care. One, you can own a business, run a business, and just personally care about the environmental impact and have that be a value on top of creating your product or creating value for your shareholders. Many companies that are funded by other investors might have pressure from those investors to do things that are environmentally friendly. Today, ESG investing has completely taken off, and a lot of firms, especially a lot of the big ones, have mandates where they can't invest in, say, companies directly or potentially funds that invest in companies that aren't kind of fitting to the ESG principles. Often there's UN guidelines on kind of sustainability that are being followed. So there's a lot of reasons to care, but what's great about Bitcoin is even if you don't care about say the environment in some capacity, or more specifically reducing energy usage or reducing carbon emissions, just by using the most efficient option, you're going to have an impact doing that.
And I would say, I didn't used to get this question until the last year or two in particular. And I think it's because of the media attention and coverage that's been put on this energy question, which I don't want to say is unfair, but I think sort of doesn't I think some media do it better than others. They don't ask the right question. They go, oh, that uses more energy than a country, but they don't ask for what, right? No one sits around asking how much energy Amazon uses, or Cisco, or your cloud storage servers. Nobody asks that question because you don't see it. But with Bitcoin mining, people see these pictures of mining rigs in some farm somewhere and go, oh my God, look at all that. So it's a legitimate question. It's just not been asked the right way, but businesses are asking us a lot these days.
Yeah, Elon Musk definitely hasn't necessarily helped that. Although he has some good intuitions, as he kind of realized, oh, I'm actually supporting a version of Bitcoin that's really inefficient. What if we just make Dogecoin a lot like BSV? Unfortunately, he has not yet taken the leap to kind of just using the kind of thing that's out there, but I'm confident he will, right?
Everything he talks about what should be done, we're already doing.
Yeah.
So, okay, any other questions before we take our lunch break here? If not, thank you so much, Zach.
Of course.